Imagine a city that didn't start with marble palaces or golden statues. It started with mud, blood, and a desperate fight for survival on 7 hills overlooking a river. This is Rome, but not the Rome of emperors and gladiators you've seen in movies. This is the raw, violent beginning, a place where your neighbor could be your enemy and the wilderness was always waiting just beyond the last hut. Before the Caesars, before the empire, there was something else, a radical experiment that would shake the world. A republic. But how did a collection of shepherds and farmers forge the most powerful machine of conquest the ancient world had ever seen? The answer isn't in their victories. It's in their deepest fears, their bitterest hatreds, and a single, bloody act of rebellion that still echoes through time. For over 200 years, kings ruled Rome. Some were wise, others were brutal, but the last one, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was a tyrant in every sense of the word. He stole land, murdered his rivals, and treated the people like property. His son only made things worse. In 509 BC, a noblewoman named Lucretia was assaulted by the king's son. Rather than live with the shame, she took her own life, but only after calling her father and husband to her side, demanding vengeance. Her body was carried into the forum, and the sight of it ignited a fury that no army could stop. The people rose up. The king was driven out, his family exiled forever, and in that moment of incendiary rage, the Roman Republic was born. But creating a republic is easy. Keeping it alive? That's the real story. But who would rule now that the king was gone? The answer was a power-sharing nightmare. 2 consuls, elected every year, each with the power to veto the other. A senate filled with the oldest, richest families, the patricians, holding the real influence. It was designed to prevent one man from becoming too powerful, but it created a new problem. The plebeians, the common people who fought in the wars and paid the taxes, had no say at all. They were trapped. Debts could be enforced with chains and even slavery, and the courts were run by their masters. For over a decade, the tension simmered until the plebeians had finally had enough. In 494 BC, they did the unthinkable. They marched out of the city to a nearby hill and refused to come back. A strike. A revolt that left Rome defenseless and its economy in shambles. The patricians panicked. They had no army, no workers, no one to run the city. They had to negotiate. The result was a new office, the Tribune of the Plebs, a sacred position with the power to veto any law and protect any citizen from an unjust magistrate. It was a massive victory for the common people. But it was only the first battle in a class war that would rage for centuries. The plebeians wanted written laws, so they could no longer be twisted by patrician judges. In 450 BC, after years of pressure, the laws were finally carved onto 12 bronze tablets and placed in the forum for everyone to see. This was the birth of Roman law, the foundation for legal systems around the world today. But the fight was far from over. The struggle for power between the classes would define Roman politics, leading to violence, assassination, and ultimately, the fall of the Republic itself. But that was centuries away. By the early 4th century BC, Rome was a growing power, but it was still a small fish in a big pond. To the north, beyond the Apennine Mountains, lived a fearsome people called the Gauls. They were tall, fierce warriors who had already sacked many Etruscan cities. In 390 BC, they came for Rome. Led by their chieftain Brennus, the Gallic army crushed the Roman legions at the Battle of the Allia, a river just a few miles from the city. It was a complete disaster. The Romans who survived fled into the city, but there was no time to prepare a defense. The Gauls poured into Rome, looting, burning, and killing. The city was sacked. The people who couldn't escape took refuge on the Capitoline Hill, the last stronghold. For 7 months, the Gauls besieged them. Rome, the city that would one day rule the world, was on the brink of extinction. The Gauls finally left after demanding a heavy ransom in gold, but the psychological scar never healed. Rome had been humiliated, its pride shattered. The city needed to rebuild both its walls and its confidence. But what really happened on that dark night when the Gauls tried to scale the Capitoline Hill? Legend says the sacred geese of Juno, kept in her temple, sensed the enemy and began to cackle, waking the defenders just in time. It's a story of divine intervention, but the truth is more human. This was the moment Rome learned that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was the catalyst for a total military overhaul, new tactics, new weapons, and a new unbreakable will to never be sacked again. But who was the man who would lead this transformation? Who was the general who would turn a broken city into a war machine? His name was Marcus Furius Camillus, and his story, and the rise of the legions, is a tale of ambition, betrayal, and blood that we are just beginning to uncover. What will it take for Rome to rise from the ashes? Rome lay in ashes. The Gauls had come, seen, and conquered, leaving nothing but scorched earth and shattered pride. But from the smoke, one man emerged, a man the Senate had once exiled for daring to be too powerful. Marcus Furius Camillus. Now, with the city on its knees, they had no choice but to call him back. And he didn't return with mercy in his heart, he returned with fire. His first act: to refuse the ransom. Instead of paying off the barbarians, he marched straight into their camp and took back every ounce of gold the Gauls had stolen, and then some. But this wasn't just about revenge. Camillus understood something his predecessors didn't. Rome's old way of fighting, the rigid, slow-moving phalanx, was obsolete. It had failed against the wild, unpredictable Gallic charge. He needed to build a new kind of army, a machine built for war. And he knew exactly where to start. Camillus threw out the old rulebook. For centuries, Rome had copied the Greek way of war, a solid wall of spearmen called a phalanx. It was powerful, but it was slow and brittle. Once the line broke, everything collapsed. The Gauls proved that. So, Camillus introduced the manipular system. He divided the army into smaller, flexible units called maniples. These weren't just one big block of men, they were a honeycomb of independent cells on the battlefield. Now, imagine this: the first line, the hastati, the young and impetuous, threw their javelins and then charged. If they got into trouble, they could fall back through the gaps in the second line, the principes, the seasoned veterans. And behind them stood the triarii, the old guard, the last line of defense, armed with long spears. It was a system designed to keep the line flexible, to absorb a charge without breaking. This wasn't just a new formation, it was a new philosophy. The army wasn't a single spear, it was a machine with many moving parts, each one ready to take the lead. But the manipular system was only half the battle. Camillus knew that a new formation needed new equipment and a new kind of soldier. He standardized the gear. Every legionary got a heavy javelin called a pilum, designed to bend on impact so the enemy couldn't throw it back. And he gave them the scutum, a large, curved shield that protected almost the entire body. With this, they could form a nearly impenetrable wall. But the real change was in the training. Camillus drilled his men relentlessly, day after day, until their movements were instinctive. He introduced the concept of the professional soldier, a man who didn't just fight for a season, but who made war his craft. He taught them how to build a fortified camp every single night, turning the army into a moving fortress. This was a revolution. Rome wasn't just fielding an army anymore, it was building a war machine. And the machine was hungry. The first test came sooner than anyone expected, as the Gauls, emboldened by their earlier victory, returned for more plunder. The Gauls were back, but this time, they were walking into a trap. Camillus chose the battlefield, a narrow valley where the Gallic numbers and their wild charges would be useless. The new Roman army stood waiting, silent and disciplined. The Gauls charged, screaming their war cries, expecting to see the same terrified rabble they had routed years before. Instead, they met a wall of shields. The pilums flew, a deadly rain of iron that shattered the Gallic front ranks. Then, the maniples advanced, not as one giant block, but as a series of coordinated, rotating units. While one unit engaged the enemy, the next would step into the gaps and hit the Gauls from the side. It was a brutal, efficient slaughter. The Gauls, who had never faced such a flexible and disciplined enemy, broke. They fled the field, leaving thousands behind. Rome had won. The humiliation of 390 BC was avenged. And for the first time in a generation, the city could breathe again. But Camillus knew this victory was just a beginning, not an end. Camillus had saved Rome, but in saving it, he had made himself a king in all but name. He rode through the streets in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, a symbol of Jupiter himself. The people cheered, but the Senate watched with cold, calculating eyes. They had called him back, but they had never trusted him. They remembered his arrogance, his wealth, and his belief that he was above the law. They remembered that he had once been exiled for parading his power too openly. Now, he was doing it again. The senators whispered in the shadows. They accused him of using public funds for his own glory, of stealing the spoils of war that belonged to the state. The charges were flimsy, but the fear was real. They didn't want a hero, they wanted a servant. And so, in a cruel twist of fate, the man who had rebuilt Rome's army and saved its people was again accused and driven into exile. The savior of the Republic was cast out by the Republic he had saved. But Rome's enemies were not done with her. With the great general gone, the old threats began to stir again. To the south and east, in the mountains of Samnium, a tough, fierce people were growing bolder. They had watched Rome's war with the Gauls from afar, and they saw weakness. They saw a city that was rich from plunder but divided and leaderless. The Senate, in its arrogance, had traded its best sword for the comfort of its own pride. They thought they could control Camillus's legacy, but they had forgotten that the Republic was still surrounded by wolves. The legions were strong, but they were untested against a foe as disciplined as themselves. The Samnites were not wild barbarians like the Gauls, they were mountain warriors, hardened by a lifetime of guerrilla warfare. They knew every pass, every peak, every hidden trail. The coming war would be a different kind of beast, a long, grueling, and bloody conflict that would test Rome's very soul. And the man who should have been leading them was walking the lonely road of exile. The question that hangs in the air, sharper than any gladius, is this: will the Republic survive its own arrogance before it even has a chance to face its enemies? And what fate awaits the hero it abandoned? The exile of Camillus left a void sharper than any spear. Rome's confidence was shaken, but her pride was wounded. The Senate, in its short-sighted arrogance, believed they had solved a problem. They had silenced the man who could lead them. But out in the mountains of Samnium, the wolves were circling. The Samnites weren't just some barbarian horde crashing against the gates. They were a nation of warriors, bred in the high passes, raised on the harsh code of survival. They watched Rome's internal strife with amusement, and then with ambition. They saw a city rich with plunder, but fractured and weak. They began to probe the borders, testing the strength of the legions that had once seemed invincible under Camillus. And Rome, leaderless and divided, could only watch as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The Republic was about to learn that the greatest threat isn't always the enemy at the gates, but the one you create within your own walls. The first clash came in the mountain passes of Campania. The Romans, still relying on the rigid tactics of the phalanx, marched into the hills with the confidence of a bull entering a bullring. The Samnites didn't meet them in the open field. They melted into the forests, using the terrain as a weapon. They ambushed supply lines, rolled boulders down on the columns, and attacked at night with terrifying speed. The legions, so effective on the plains, were lost in the labyrinth of peaks and gorges. Every step was a trap. Every shadow held a spear. The Roman commanders, trained in the old ways, couldn't adapt to this invisible enemy. They were fighting a war of attrition they couldn't win. The soldiers, brave but bewildered, began to lose heart. They saw their comrades fall not in glorious battle, but in ignoble ambush after ambush. Rome was bleeding, not from a single wound, but from 1,000 cuts. And the Senate, safe in their marble halls, had no idea of the horror their soldiers were facing in the unforgiving mountains. Then came the Caudine Forks, a name that would be etched into Roman memory as a synonym for disgrace. The army, lured by a false sense of security, marched into a narrow valley with only 2 exits. Both were swiftly blocked by the Samnites. The Romans were trapped, like fish in a barrel. They couldn't fight, the space was too tight. They couldn't retreat, the path was sealed. The Samnite commander, Caius Pontius, didn't want a slaughter. He wanted a humiliation so total that Rome would never dare threaten his people again. He forced the entire Roman army to lay down their arms, strip to their undergarments, and pass under a yoke of spears, a symbol of utter submission. The soldiers, the proud sons of Rome, had to bow their heads and walk through the degrading arch, their heads hung in shame. Then, they were allowed to return home, broken and empty-handed. It was a defeat that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arrogance. Rome's military might lay in tatters, a laughingstock to her enemies. The Republic had been brought to its knees, not by a superior force, but by its own foolish pride. The shame of the Caudine Forks was a poison that spread through every street and alley of Rome. The Senate was in chaos, blaming each other, blaming the absent Camillus. The army was a shadow of its former self, its spirit broken. But in this darkest hour, a new figure began to emerge from the ranks of the patricians. His name was Titus Manlius Torquatus. He was a man of iron discipline, a veteran of countless campaigns, and a soldier's soldier. He was also ruthless, unforgiving, and deeply suspicious of the common people. He believed that Rome's weakness came not from its generals, but from its lack of moral fiber. He demanded absolute obedience, not just in war, but in every aspect of life. He was the opposite of the charismatic Camillus. He had no charm, no warmth. He was a cold, hard blade. But he was exactly what a humiliated Rome needed, a leader who could rebuild the army's discipline from the ground up, a man who would accept nothing less than total victory. His methods were brutal, but his results were undeniable. The legions, under his iron hand, began to harden into a fighting force that had no equal. Torquatus's discipline was legendary, but it came at a terrible price. His own son, a young cavalry officer, disobeyed his father's strict order not to engage in single combat with the enemy. The boy, eager for glory and seeing a chance to prove himself, rode out against an enemy champion and defeated him. He returned to camp triumphant, expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, his father, Titus Manlius Torquatus, called an assembly of the entire army. With a voice as cold as a winter wind, he accused his own son of breaking military discipline. He reminded the soldiers that orders were given to be obeyed, not to be interpreted. Then, in front of the stunned legionaries, he ordered his own son to be beheaded. The army was horrified. Some wept, some cried out for mercy. But Torquatus remained unmoved. He declared that his duty to the Republic came before his love for his son. This act of brutal, inhuman severity sent a shockwave through Rome. It was a lesson in absolute obedience that would never be forgotten. The Republic was saved, but at what cost? A father had killed his own child for the sake of an order. This was the terrible arithmetic of power, and it left a scar on the Roman soul that would never fully heal. The Samnite Wars dragged on, a brutal grind of ambush, siege, and reprisal. Rome, tempered by the fires of humiliation and forged by the iron will of Torquatus, began to win victories. But it was a hollow kind of victory, paid for in blood and sorrow. The Republic was no longer the naive city-state that had been humiliated at the Caudine Forks. It was a hard, cynical, militaristic machine. It had learned to survive, but it had lost something essential in the process. The old virtues of Camillus, of wisdom and mercy, were replaced by a cold, calculating efficiency. The Republic was becoming an empire in all but name. And as the legions marched home from the final campaign, victorious but weary, a new fear began to take root. What would happen when the power of the military was no longer checked by the will of the Senate? What would happen when a general like Torquatus, with his ruthless discipline and absolute authority, decided that he no longer needed the Republic? A hero had been exiled, a son had been killed, and the Republic had been saved, but the seeds of its own destruction were now firmly planted in its own soil. The next war would not be against the Samnites, but from within. And the man who would trigger it was already walking the streets of Rome, waiting for his moment. Who was he? What dark ambition was he nursing that would tear the Republic apart and set the stage for the rise of a new kind of power? That is the story we will tell next. If you want to be there when the Republic faces its greatest internal threat, make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter is one of betrayal, ambition, and the death of an ideal. The Republic had survived, but it was a survivor with a limp and a scar. The Samnite Wars had bled Rome white, forcing it to evolve from a simple city-state into a brutal, efficient war machine. Yet the peace, if you could call it that, was uneasy. The old patrician families, the ones who had led Rome to victory, were growing fat on the spoils of war, their villas filling with looted gold and Greek slaves. Meanwhile, the common foot soldier, the man who had actually bled on the field, returned to a plot of scorched earth and a mountain of debt. This was the powder keg that Appius Claudius Caecus, a man with a name that meant, the blind, was about to light. You see, Appius wasn't blind in the way you might think. He was blind to the old rules, blind to tradition, and absolutely blind to the authority of the Senate. He was a populist, a firebrand, and he had a plan that would either save the Republic or tear it apart. Appius Claudius didn't just break the rules, he smashed them into pieces and danced on the rubble. First, he took the census, the sacred roll that determined your rank, your vote, and your place in society. And he did the unthinkable. He allowed the sons of freedmen, the children of former slaves, to enroll in the rural tribes, giving them a political voice they had never possessed. The patricians screamed bloody murder. They saw their ancient privilege being diluted by the mob. But Appius was just getting started. He then unveiled a project so audacious, so massive in scale, that it seemed like the fantasy of a madman, a road stretching from Rome all the way to Capua, a highway for legions and merchants alike. And an aqueduct, a stone river snaking over the countryside to bring fresh water into the heart of the city. The Senate balked at the cost, but Appius pushed it through, financing it with public funds and captured booty. He was reshaping the very geography of power, linking Rome to its conquests in stone and water, making the Republic one indivisible whole. But in doing so, he made enemies who would never forgive him. But while Appius was transforming the city itself, the war with the Samnites was far from over. It was a conflict that had become a brutal, generations-long feud. By 295 BC, the Samnites had formed a grand alliance with the Etruscans, the Gauls, and the Umbrians, a coalition of every power that feared Rome's relentless expansion. It was a final, desperate gamble to crush the Republic before it could swallow them all. The armies met on a vast plain near Sentinum, in the heart of Italy. The Roman forces were commanded by two consuls, the stern, disciplined Fabius Rullianus, and the fiery, devout Publius Decius Mus. The allied army was enormous, their battle lines stretching for miles. The fate of the Republic hung by a thread. On the first day of battle, the Roman left wing, facing the Gauls, began to buckle under the sheer ferocity of the assault. The line broke. Panic started to spread. It was the moment the Samnite alliance had been waiting for. The entire Roman army was on the verge of a catastrophic rout that would have ended the Republic forever. It was in this crisis that Publius Decius Mus performed an act that would be etched into Roman legend forever. He saw the left wing collapsing, saw the army beginning to break, and he knew that only a miracle could save them. So he decided to make one. Calling for the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, Decius Mus stripped off his armor and stood before his soldiers. He repeated the ancient formula, the devotio. He vowed his life and the lives of the enemy to the gods of the underworld in exchange for a Roman victory. He was offering himself as a sacrifice. When the words were spoken, he donned his toga, mounted his horse, and charged alone into the thickest ranks of the Gallic warriors. He was cut down instantly, his body lost in the chaos. But his sacrifice had its intended effect. The Roman soldiers, witnessing their general's suicidal courage, were filled with a terrible, desperate fury. They rallied, reformed their lines, and countercharged with such violence that the Gauls faltered. The sacrifice of Decius Mus had turned the tide. The Republic was saved, but it had paid for that salvation with the life of a consul and the promise of an eternal debt to the gods. The victory at Sentinum broke the back of the Samnite coalition, but it didn't end the war. It took another 4 years of grinding campaigns, sieges, and brutal reprisals before the Samnites finally sued for peace in 290 BC. Rome was now the undisputed master of central Italy. But the republic that emerged from these wars was a different creature entirely. It was a nation forged in iron and blood, its citizens hardened by relentless conflict. The army, once a citizen militia, was becoming a professional force with a taste for plunder and a loyalty to its commanders that rivaled its loyalty to the state. And it was in this atmosphere that a man like Lucius Papirius Cursor could rise to prominence. He was a product of this new Rome, brilliant, arrogant, and endowed with an almost supernatural belief in his own authority. He was the most decorated general of his age, a man whose name was a byword for military excellence. But he was also fiercely jealous of his prestige and utterly ruthless in his dealings with anyone he saw as a rival. He was the embodiment of the Republic's greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. Papirius Cursor's most infamous act was legendary for its cold-blooded severity. During a campaign, his master of the horse, a young nobleman named Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, had won a brilliant victory against the enemy against the dictator's explicit orders. He had broken a rule, even though he had won. When Papirius heard of this, he was enraged, not by the disobedience, but by the challenge to his own authority. He demanded that Fabius be executed for insubordination. The entire army, the Senate, and the people of Rome were aghast. Fabius's father begged for mercy, the legions threatened to mutiny, but Papirius remained unmoved, insisting that discipline was the very foundation of the Republic. Only a dramatic, last-minute appeal from Fabius's father, throwing himself at the dictator's feet, finally swayed him. He spared the young man's life, but only after a humiliating public apology. The message was clear: in this new Rome, the general's word was law, more absolute than any decree of the Senate. The Republic had won its wars, but it had created a monster of its own making. The men who could win its battles were becoming more powerful than the state they fought for. The question was no longer if this power would be turned inward, but when. The stage was set for a final, terrible conflict that would test the very soul of the Republic. And the man who would bring it to the brink was not a foreign enemy, but a Roman hero. Who was he? What would he do? The answer lies in the blood-soaked fields of the next great war. The dust had barely settled on the Samnite Wars when a new storm broke over the horizon. A storm from the east, led by a man who believed he was the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. His name was Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, and he brought with him the deadliest weapon the Mediterranean had ever seen, war elephants. These towering beasts, armored and unstoppable, crashed into the Roman lines like living battering rams. Horses panicked, formations shattered, and the legions, for all their discipline, were thrown into chaos. The Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC was a brutal lesson in humility. Rome tasted defeat for the first time in decades, and the taste was bitter. But even in that moment of catastrophe, a strange new figure emerged from the ranks, a man who would become legend not for his victories, but for his incorruptible character, Gaius Fabricius Luscinus. After the shock of Heraclea, Pyrrhus expected Rome to sue for peace. He sent his trusted advisor, Cinnes, to the Senate with generous terms. But Rome was not broken. Instead, they sent an embassy to negotiate the release of prisoners, and at its head was Gaius Fabricius. This was a man of the old republic, a farmer-soldier who owned nothing but a small plot of land and a reputation for unshakable integrity. Pyrrhus, intrigued by this legend of Roman poverty, tried to bribe him. He offered Fabricius gold, silver, and a position in his court. Fabricius refused it all, famously telling the king that he preferred to rule over those who had gold than to possess it himself. Stunned, Pyrrhus then tried to scare him. He ordered his largest elephant to stand behind a curtain and, at a signal, let out a deafening trumpet call. Fabricius, unflinching, calmly turned to the king and said, "Your gold has no power over me, and neither does your beast." But Fabricius's integrity had a dark, calculating side. Before leaving the camp, he discovered a plot by a traitorous Roman doctor to poison Pyrrhus. Instead of using it to win the war, Fabricius did something shocking. He sent a warning to Pyrrhus, exposing the plot and telling him to beware of his own physicians. It was an act of such profound honor that it shook Pyrrhus to his core. He was fighting a people who were not just brave, but incorrigibly virtuous. "If this man is my enemy, then I am fighting an impossible war," he is said to have remarked. This was a masterstroke, not of kindness, but of psychological warfare. Rome was showing the Greek world that it was not just a military power, but a moral one. It was a message that would win them more allies than any battle. Fabricius returned to Rome a hero, but he knew the war was far from over. Pyrrhus was wounded, not defeated, and he was massing his forces for a second, even more terrible, confrontation. The second clash came at Asculum in 279 BC. It was a savage, grinding battle that lasted 2 days. Pyrrhus, learning from his mistakes, deployed his elephants more carefully, protected by infantry. The Roman legions fought with a ferocity that shocked the Greeks. They even devised a terrifying counter-weapon, oxen-drawn carts fitted with long spikes and flaming pots, designed to scare and burn the elephants. The battle was so bloody that the ground was slick with gore. In the end, the Romans were forced to retreat, but they had inflicted massive casualties on Pyrrhus's army, including many of his veteran officers. The Greek king, looking over the battlefield littered with his best men, uttered the phrase that would echo through history: "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." He had won the field, but he had lost his army. It was a victory that was no victory at all, a Pyrrhic victory, a term we still use today. The stalemate after Asculum forced Pyrrhus to make a strategic gamble. He abandoned the campaign in Italy and sailed his battered army to Sicily, leaving Rome with a free hand. It was a fatal mistake. While Pyrrhus became bogged down in the endless Sicilian wars against Carthage, Rome rebuilt her strength. They rearmed, reorganized, and, crucially, they learned. The fear of war elephants was conquered, and they integrated the lessons of the phalanx into their own tactics. When Pyrrhus finally returned to Italy in 275 BC, he was a shadow of his former self, his army exhausted and his treasury empty. Rome met him at the Battle of Beneventum, and this time, there was no contest. The legions smashed his demoralized forces, capturing his elephants and parading them through the streets of Rome. Pyrrhus fled back to Greece, utterly defeated, leaving behind a legend of his own brilliance and a profound respect for the unyielding power of the Roman Republic. The war with Pyrrhus was over. The Republic had survived its first true test against a great foreign power, and it had emerged stronger, more confident, and with a terrifying new hunger. They had seen the wealth of the Greek world and the power of its armies, and they knew they could match it all. But this victory also revealed a dangerous new reality. The legions were no longer just citizen soldiers defending their homes, they were a professional, conquering force. They had tasted plunder and they wanted more. The Senate was filled with men like Fabricius, who embodied the old virtues, but it was also breeding a new kind of politician, men who saw foreign wars as a path to personal glory and power. The Republic was becoming an empire, and with that transformation, the seeds of its own destruction were being sown. The question hanging over the forum was no longer whether Rome would conquer the world, but who, within Rome, would conquer it first. The next great enemy would not come from Greece or the mountains of Samnium, but from the city of Carthage, a rival so powerful that its clash with Rome would decide the fate of the ancient world. But that is a story for another time, one that will test Rome like never before. What secret did Carthage hold that would bring Rome to the brink of annihilation? And who was the general who would defy the Senate itself to save her? Subscribe and join us next time, as we unlock the terrifying legend of the man who crossed the Alps. The victory over Pyrrhus had a double-edged effect. It didn't just secure Rome's dominance over Italy, it opened a Pandora's box of ambition. The old values of Fabricius, the incorruptible farmer-soldier, were being replaced by a new breed of Roman, men who saw the glittering wealth of the Greek cities and the vast potential of the Mediterranean and wanted it all. The Senate was no longer just a council of elders, it was becoming a boardroom for imperial strategy. The legions, once citizen militias who returned to their farms after a campaign, were now hardened veterans who knew only one trade, war. They were loyal not to the Republic, but to their commanders. This shift in loyalty was the most dangerous change of all. A general with a devoted army and a taste for plunder was a threat to the very idea of a republic. The machinery of conquest was oiled and ready, humming with a dark energy. The question was not if Rome would expand, but who would be the next victim. And just across the narrow stretch of sea, a rival was watching, a commercial empire that had grown fat on trade and was willing to fight to keep its monopoly. But before Carthage, there was a reckoning at home. The Republic was built on a delicate balance between the patricians and the plebeians. The Punic threat, however, demanded a new kind of unity. The old aristocratic families were being overshadowed by a new class of wealthy plebeians who had made their fortunes in trade and military contracts. They demanded a share of political power. The conflict of the orders, once thought settled, was reignited. The Senate, desperate to avoid internal strife on the eve of a major war, was forced to make concessions. They opened up the highest offices of the state, including the consulship, to plebeians. This was a revolutionary change. Men like Gaius Duilius, a man of humble origins, could now rise to command fleets and armies. This new blood brought a ruthlessness and a hunger for success that the old aristocracy lacked. They were not fighting for honor, they were fighting for survival and profit. The Republic was being transformed from within, becoming more meritocratic, but also more aggressive. The stage was set for a conflict that would demand every ounce of this new Roman energy. The spark that ignited the powder keg came from an unlikely place, the city of Messana on the northeastern tip of Sicily. A group of Italian mercenaries, the Mamertines, had seized the city and were using it as a base for piracy. When the Syracusans, led by the tyrant Hiero II, moved to crush them, the Mamertines faced annihilation. In desperation, they appealed to both Rome and Carthage for help. Carthage, ever eager to check Syracuse's power, sent a fleet and a garrison to Messana, effectively taking control. The Mamertines, now under Carthaginian thumb, regretted their decision. They sent a secret embassy to Rome, offering to surrender the city to the Republic instead. The Roman Senate was thrown into a frenzy. To accept would mean war with Carthage, a naval power Rome could not hope to match. To refuse would mean allowing Carthage to control a strategic choke point in the Strait of Messina, a dagger pointed directly at the heart of Italy. The decision was agonizing, and the debate in the Senate was fierce. The old guard, fearing the unknown, argued for caution. But the new, ambitious faction saw an opportunity too great to pass up. The Senate eventually agreed to accept the Mamertines' offer, but they made a fatal strategic error. Instead of sending a full consular army, they dispatched a small force under the command of Appius Claudius Caudex, a man whose name would be forever linked with this reckless gamble. The plan was to cross the strait, secure Messana, and present Carthage with a fait accompli. But the Carthaginian fleet was patrolling the waters, and they were not about to let the Romans waltz in. When Caudex's ships approached, they were confronted by the Carthaginian navy. A tense standoff ensued. Caudex, known for his fiery temper, was not one to back down. He gave the order to force the crossing. The Roman ships, clumsy and slow compared to the sleek Carthaginian quinquiremes, were easy targets. But in a stroke of audacity, Caudex used a clever ruse to land his troops without a major naval battle. The result was a political and military mess. Rome was now officially at war with Carthage, but with no clear strategy and a navy that was vastly inferior. They had kicked a hornet's nest, and the hornets were very, very angry. The First Punic War had begun, a conflict that would last for over 2 decades. The first major test came at the Battle of Agrigentum in 262 BC. The Romans, having learned from their initial missteps, laid siege to the city, a major Carthaginian stronghold. The Carthaginians, under the general Hanno, attempted to relieve the city with a massive army that included war elephants. The Roman legions, terrified but disciplined, faced a terrifying double threat, the garrison inside the city and Hanno's relief force outside. For months, the siege dragged on, with disease and hunger taking their toll on both sides. The Romans were learning the brutal art of siege warfare, a skill that would define their future conquests. Finally, a massive battle erupted. The Romans, using their superior discipline and the rugged terrain to their advantage, managed to break the Carthaginian lines. Hanno's army was routed, and the city fell. But the victory was bittersweet. The Carthaginian garrison escaped under the cover of night, slipping away to fight another day. The Romans had won the battle but not the war. They had also paid a terrible price, and the treasury was nearly empty. The lesson was clear: Carthage would not be defeated in a single, grand confrontation. This would be a war of attrition, a war of logistics, and a war that would require Rome to become something it had never been before, a naval power. Agrigentum was a brutal awakening. Rome had won a costly victory, but Carthage's navy still ruled the waves. They could resupply their armies, raid the Italian coast, and cut off Roman trade. The war would be lost if Rome couldn't challenge them at sea. This was a nearly impossible task. Rome had no naval tradition, no experienced sailors, and no shipbuilding industry. Yet, the Senate made an audacious decision: they would build a fleet from scratch. They captured a Carthaginian quinquireme that had run aground and used it as a blueprint. Within months, Roman shipyards were churning out hundreds of warships. But having ships wasn't enough, they needed a way to win. In a moment of genius, the Romans invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, turning a naval battle into a land battle on the sea. This innovation would change the course of the war. It was a desperate gamble, a testament to Roman ingenuity and their refusal to accept defeat. The man who would lead this new fleet was Gaius Duilius, the plebeian consul. He was about to prove that Rome could adapt to any challenge, no matter how daunting. The Republic was on the cusp of a naval revolution, and the world would never be the same. In 260 BC, Duilius met the Carthaginian fleet off the coast of Mylae. The Carthaginians, confident in their superior seamanship, mocked the Roman ships. They expected an easy victory. But as they closed in, the Romans dropped their Corvus boarding bridges. The Carthaginian ships were suddenly locked in place, unable to maneuver. Roman legionaries, veterans of countless land battles, swarmed across the bridges and engaged the Carthaginian sailors in hand-to-hand combat. The battle turned into a massacre. The Carthaginian admirals, stunned by this unorthodox tactic, were defeated. Duilius won a stunning victory, capturing 31 enemy ships and becoming the first Roman to be awarded a naval triumph. The sea, once a barrier to Roman power, was now a highway for their ambition. This victory was more than just a military success, it was a psychological breakthrough. Rome had proven that they could beat Carthage at their own game. The Republic was no longer a landlocked state, it was a maritime power on the rise. But the war was far from over. The next phase would bring Rome to the brink of ruin, testing its very foundations. What secret did Carthage hold that would bring Rome to the brink of annihilation? And who was the general who would defy the Senate itself to save her? Subscribe and join us next time, as we unlock the terrifying legend of the man who crossed the Alps. The victory at Mylae sent a shockwave through the Mediterranean. Rome, the landlocked city of farmers, had just humiliated the greatest naval power on earth. The name of Gaius Duilius was on everyone's lips. But victory breeds ambition, and ambition breeds recklessness. The Senate, drunk on success, decided they didn't just want to fight Carthage, they wanted to destroy it. They set their sights on Africa itself, the heart of the Carthaginian Empire. The plan was audacious, a direct invasion that would end the war in one decisive blow. The man chosen to lead this grand crusade was Marcus Atilius Regulus, a consul of iron discipline and unwavering patriotism. He was the perfect Roman, stoic, brave, and utterly devoted to the Republic. But as his fleet sailed south, leaving the familiar coast of Sicily behind, he was sailing into the unknown. He was sailing into a trap that would test his soul and forge a legend of suffering. What awaited him on the shores of Africa was a test not of his army, but of his very character. Regulus's army landed in Africa and, at first, everything went their way. They crushed the Carthaginian forces in a series of skirmishes, capturing towns and spreading terror across the countryside. The Carthaginians, unprepared for a war on their own soil, were desperate. They were so desperate that they sued for peace. But Regulus, blinded by his own success, offered terms so harsh they were designed to be rejected. He demanded that Carthage surrender its navy, give up its overseas territories, and become a client state of Rome. It was an ultimatum that left Carthage with nothing to lose. Instead of surrendering, they fought back with a fury born of desperation. They hired a new general, a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus. This man, a master of tactics, saw through the Roman legion's strengths and weaknesses. He reorganized the Carthaginian army, choosing a battlefield where his cavalry and war elephants could be used to devastating effect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the myth of Roman invincibility. The battle took place near the town of Tunes. Xanthippus' plan worked flawlessly. His war elephants, massive and terrifying, smashed through the Roman front lines, creating chaos and panic. The Roman infantry, so used to fighting on their own terms, was broken by the charge. Then, the Carthaginian cavalry, which had been held in reserve, swept around the flanks and attacked the Romans from the rear. It was a massacre. The Roman army was annihilated. Thousands were killed, and thousands more, including Regulus himself, were taken prisoner. The man who had been on the verge of conquering Carthage was now a captive, a trophy to be paraded through the streets. The defeat at Tunes was a catastrophic blow to Rome, a stark reminder that their triumphs were not inevitable. The Republic had lost an entire army, and its most celebrated general was in chains. For Carthage, it was a moment of salvation. They had not only stopped the Roman invasion but had captured a symbol of Roman power. What they would do with Regulus would become one of the most chilling tales of the ancient world. But the disaster was not over. The Roman fleet that had transported the army to Africa was sent to evacuate the survivors. It was a fleet filled with despair, not triumph. As it sailed back towards Italy, it was caught in a violent storm near the southern coast of Sicily. The Romans, who had so recently mastered naval warfare, were no match for the fury of the sea. Their ships, built too lightly and with crews lacking experience, were tossed around like toys. The sky turned black, the winds howled, and the waves swallowed ship after ship. Hundreds of vessels were lost, and tens of thousands of men drowned. It was the worst naval disaster in Roman history, a tragedy that eclipsed even the defeat at Tunes. The Republic had lost not just a fleet, but a generation of citizens. The Romans saw this not as an accident, but as divine punishment. They had grown arrogant, and the gods had struck them down. The sea, which had been their highway to victory, had become their graveyard. Rome was now crippled, its treasury empty, and its people in mourning. The war with Carthage, which had seemed so close to a triumphant end, was now a desperate struggle for survival. But Rome refused to yield. With a stubbornness that would become their defining trait, they rebuilt their fleet, and they rebuilt their army. The war dragged on, a brutal, grinding conflict of sieges and raids. The focus shifted back to Sicily, where the two powers fought for control of key cities. It was there, in 249 BC, that a new Roman commander emerged, Publius Claudius Pulcher. He was arrogant, impetuous, and a member of the proudest patrician families. He believed he was destined for greatness. He was given command of a new fleet and ordered to attack the Carthaginian stronghold of Drepana. But Claudius was not a strategist like Duilius or a stoic like Regulus. He was a man of rash decisions and bad omens. Before the battle, the sacred chickens were consulted, a ritual to determine the gods' favor. When the chickens refused to eat, it was a clear sign of impending doom. But Claudius, in a fit of rage and blasphemy, threw the chickens overboard, shouting, "If they will not eat, let them drink." It was a moment of supreme arrogance that sealed his fate and the fate of his fleet. The gods were not mocked. At the Battle of Drepana, the Carthaginian fleet, commanded by the brilliant admiral Adherbal, outmaneuvered Claudius's ships. The Romans were caught in a narrow harbor, unable to deploy their superior infantry or their corvus boarding bridges. The Carthaginian ships, faster and more agile, rammed them from all sides. It was a complete and utter rout. Claudius fled the battle, leaving his fleet to be destroyed. Of his 120 ships, only 30 escaped. It was a defeat so humiliating that it sent shockwaves through Rome. Claudius was put on trial for his incompetence and blasphemy, and was heavily fined. He was ruined, his career over. The Republic, which had once again scraped together a fleet, had lost it all in a single, foolish afternoon. The war had now been going on for over 15 years, and Rome was exhausted, broke, and seemingly no closer to victory. Carthage seemed invincible, and Rome was on the brink of ruin. The Republic was facing its darkest hour. The question was no longer about victory, but about survival. And in this moment of desperation, what new sacrifice would the Republic demand? What secret weapon, or what terrible gamble, would be the last roll of the dice for Rome? Subscribe and join us next time, as we witness the rise of a new kind of hero, and a desperate plan that would bring the war to its most terrifying climax yet. The smoke from Drepana still hung in the air, a bitter cloud over the Roman spirit. The treasury was empty, the docks were barren, and the sea, once again, belonged to Carthage. But in the heart of the Republic, a different kind of fire was burning. It wasn't the fire of ambition, but the fire of survival, mixed with a dangerous new emotion, resentment. The common people, the plebeians, looked at their ruined city and asked a simple question: why should we die for a republic that only serves the rich? The patricians had started this war, they had commanded the fleets, and they had lost them in displays of arrogant folly. The burden of yet another defeat fell on the backs of those who had nothing to gain. The republic, built on the unity of its citizens, was cracking under the strain of a war that seemed to have no end. The Senate, desperate to find a scapegoat, turned on its own. Publius Claudius Pulcher, the man who had mocked the gods and lost the fleet, was dragged before the people. It wasn't just a trial for incompetence, it was a trial for blasphemy, for the unforgivable sin of pride. The patrician families, the Claudii, tried to protect their own, but the mob was unforgiving. They saw in Claudius not just a failed admiral, but the embodiment of everything they hated about their rulers. The verdict was swift. He was fined a sum so massive it would have crushed a lesser man, and his political career was over. The message was clear: the Republic would not tolerate such reckless arrogance. But this punishment, while satisfying the crowd's thirst for justice, did nothing to solve the real problem. Carthage was still unbeaten, and Rome had no fleet, no money, and no plan. The war, it seemed, was lost. But even as the Republic seemed to be tearing itself apart, a quiet revolution was taking place in the countryside. The war had been a disaster for the small farmers, who returned from battle to find their lands ruined and their debts mounting. The wealthy elite, the latifundia owners, were buying up these distressed lands for a fraction of their value. The gap between the rich and the poor was growing into a chasm. A new leader emerged from this crisis, a man who understood the people's pain because he was one of them. His name was Gaius Lutatius Catullus, and he was a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach the consulship. He was not a patrician, not a general from a prestigious family. He was a man of the people, a pragmatist, and a brilliant organizer. He looked at the wreckage of the war and saw not defeat, but an opportunity to rebuild Rome from the ground up, and to do it in a way that would empower the very people who had been left behind. Catullus's plan was as radical as it was simple. The Senate had no money, and the wealthy refused to pay more taxes. So he went directly to the people. He proposed a new kind of war fund, not a tax, but a patriotic loan. Every citizen, from the richest merchant to the poorest farmer, was asked to contribute what they could. In return, they would share in the spoils of victory. It was a gamble, a massive act of faith in the Republic. And surprisingly, it worked. The people, who had been on the verge of revolt, were inspired by Catullus's honesty and his faith in them. They poured their savings into his project. With this money, Catulus didn't build a traditional fleet. He built something new, a fleet of swift, light ships, designed not for boarding with the heavy corvus, but for ramming and outmaneuvering the enemy. He also recruited his crews not from the land-based poor, but from the coastal communities, men who had spent their lives on the sea and knew how to handle a ship in any weather. He was building a navy from the ground up, a navy of the people, for the Republic. The Carthaginians watched these preparations with a mixture of contempt and amusement. They had ruled the waves for generations, and they saw Catullus's citizen fleet as a desperate joke. They had no idea what was coming. In the summer of 241 BC, Catullus's fleet, a force of about 200 new ships, sailed from Rome with a single goal, to break the Carthaginian blockade of Sicily once and for all. They were not looking for a grand, heroic battle. They were looking for a strategic advantage. Catullus commanded his fleet to the Aegates Islands, a small group of rocky islets off the western coast of Sicily. He knew the Carthaginian fleet, loaded with supplies and reinforcements for their army in Sicily, would have to pass by these islands. He positioned his lighter, faster ships in the open water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was no longer the underdog, he was the hunter, and the mighty Carthage was his prey. On the morning of March 10, 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet appeared on the horizon, heavy with supplies, unprepared for a fight. The wind was in the Romans' favor, and Catullus seized the moment. He gave the order to attack. The Roman ships, lighter and faster, swooped down on the lumbering Carthaginian vessels. They didn't try to board, they simply rammed them, shattering their hulls and sending them to the bottom. It was a massacre, not a battle. The Carthaginians, commanded by Hanno, were caught completely off guard. They had no time to form a battle line, and their ships were too slow to escape. In a single morning, the war that had dragged on for over 2 decades was decided. The Carthaginian fleet was utterly destroyed. Rome, the land power, had won the sea. The Republic, born from the ashes of a monarchy, had not only survived its darkest hour, but had risen stronger than ever. But as we'll see next time, peace was not the end of the story. A new enemy was already gathering in the west, and the seeds of a conflict far greater than this one were already sown. What was the price of this victory? And what new threat would emerge from the ruins of Carthage's power? Subscribe and join us next time, as we witness the rise of a general who would become a legend, and the beginning of a war that would define Rome for generations. The roar of the crowd at Drepana still echoed in Roman ears, a sound of pure humiliation. But in the Senate, a cold, hard realism was setting in. They couldn't build another fleet, not with the treasury empty and the people bleeding. So they did something desperate. They handed Gaius Lutatius Catullus absolute command, a power they'd only given to dictators. And they gave him nothing else. No ships, no men, no money. Just a mandate: win the sea, or lose the war. Catullus stood on the docks of Ostia, looking at the handful of rotting hulls that were all that remained of Rome's naval power. The patricians laughed at him. They called him a fool and a dreamer. But Catullus wasn't listening. He was thinking. He was thinking about how you fight a naval superpower when you have no navy. And he knew the answer wasn't to build a bigger fleet. It was to build a smarter one. While Catullus plotted, the Carthaginian navy grew fat and complacent. They had blockaded Sicily for years, ferrying troops and supplies at their leisure, believing the Romans were finished on the sea. Their ships were heavy, built to carry cargo, not to fight. Their crews were slaves and mercenaries, not patriots. They had no idea that the Romans were watching their every move. Catullus had a new strategy. He didn't want a grand, fleet-to-fleet battle. He wanted a war of attrition. He took his few ships, his citizen crews, and he began a campaign of hit-and-run raids on the Carthaginian supply lines. He would strike a convoy, sink a few ships, and vanish into the mist before the Carthaginian escorts could react. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic. But it was working. The Carthaginian army in Sicily was starting to starve. Their generals were getting desperate. And their admirals, humiliated and furious, were demanding a decisive battle. They wanted to crush the Roman upstart once and for all. But Catullus knew his raids were just a band-aid. He needed a real fleet, and he needed it fast. The treasury was empty, but the people of Rome weren't. They were tired of losing. They were tired of the nobles' arrogance. And they were strangely inspired by this new man, this novice homo, who actually seemed to care about winning. So Catullus did the unthinkable. He went to the people directly. He asked them to fund the war themselves, to build a fleet not for the glory of the Senate, but for the survival of Rome. It was a gamble that could have destroyed him. He was bypassing the entire political system. But the people responded. Wealthy merchants, poor farmers, even former slaves, they all contributed. They sold their jewelry, their land, their livestock. They didn't do it for a general, they did it for their city. In a stunning display of civic unity, they built a new fleet of 200 quinquiremes, not with the state's gold, but with the people's sweat. It was a fleet built by Rome itself, and it was ready to sail. The Carthaginians watched these preparations with a mixture of contempt and amusement. They had ruled the waves for generations, and they saw Catullus's citizen fleet as a desperate joke. They had no idea what was coming. In the summer of 241 BC, Catullus's fleet, a force of about 200 new ships, sailed from Rome with a single goal, to break the Carthaginian blockade of Sicily once and for all. They were not looking for a grand, heroic battle. They were looking for a strategic advantage. Catulus commanded his fleet to the Aegates Islands, a small group of rocky islets off the western coast of Sicily. He knew the Carthaginian fleet, loaded with supplies and reinforcements for their army in Sicily, would have to pass by these islands. He positioned his lighter, faster ships in the open water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was no longer the underdog, he was the hunter, and the mighty Carthage was his prey. On the morning of March 10, 241 BC, the Carthaginian fleet appeared on the horizon, heavy with supplies, unprepared for a fight. The wind was in the Romans' favor, and Catulus seized the moment. He gave the order to attack. The Roman ships, lighter and faster, swooped down on the lumbering Carthaginian vessels. They didn't try to board, they simply rammed them, shattering their hulls and sending them to the bottom. It was a massacre, not a battle. The Carthaginians, commanded by Hanno, were caught completely off guard. They had no time to form a battle line, and their ships were too slow to escape. In a single morning, the war that had dragged on for over 2 decades was decided. The Carthaginian fleet was utterly destroyed. Rome, the land power, had won the sea. The Republic, born from the ashes of a monarchy, had not only survived its darkest hour, but had risen stronger than ever. But as we'll see next time, peace was not the end of the story. A new enemy was already gathering in the west, and the seeds of a conflict far greater than this one were already sown. What was the price of this victory? And what new threat would emerge from the ruins of Carthage's power? Subscribe and join us next time, as we witness the rise of a general who would become a legend, and the beginning of a war that would define Rome for generations. The victory bells had barely faded over Rome when the first cracks appeared in the peace. Carthage, utterly broken, couldn't pay the mercenaries who had fought for her. And those mercenaries, tens of thousands of them, from Libya to Spain, were not the kind of men to be told, wait. They rose up in a fury, a wildfire of spears and swords that consumed the Carthaginian heartland. This was the mercenary war, a conflict so brutal, so savage, that the Greeks gave it a name, the truceless war. No mercy. No quarter. Cities were sacked, their populations crucified or thrown to the elephants. For Rome, it was a convenient nightmare, watching her greatest rival tear itself apart from the inside. But the Republic's leaders weren't just sitting back. They were watching, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The peace treaty was barely 3 years old, and already, the vultures were circling. The question wasn't if Rome would exploit this chaos, but how far she would go. For 3 years, Carthage bled. The mercenaries, led by a Libyan general named Matho and a deserter named Spendius, waged a campaign of terror. They crucified their Carthaginian prisoners, and in a sickening display of defiance, they did it right in front of the city walls. But Carthage had a weapon they didn't count on, Hamilcar Barca. The same general who had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily now turned his brilliance inward. He didn't fight a war of grand battles. He fought a war of ambushes, of mountain passes, of cutting supply lines and burning crops. He bled the rebellion dry, one skirmish at a time. But even as he cornered the rebels, Rome made her move. She didn't send an army. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, Roman traders suddenly appeared in the ports of the rebel-held cities, offering grain, weapons, and coin. It was a silent, deadly declaration: Rome was funding Carthage's destruction. The Republic had learned that the cheapest way to destroy your enemy is to make them fight themselves. Rome's meddling was a calculated gamble. While Carthage was distracted, the Republic was busy flexing its own muscles. In 238 BC, Rome received a desperate plea from the mercenaries on Sardinia. The island had risen up against Carthage, and they wanted Roman protection. It was an offer too good to refuse. Rome, with a straight face, declared that Carthage had lost all rights to the island by failing to maintain order. And then, they simply took it. They also took Corsica. The Carthaginians, still fighting for their lives at home, could only protest in impotent rage. This wasn't a war, it was a mugging. But Rome wasn't done. Back in Italy, they were reminded that their own rule was not absolute. The Felici, a small but proud people in central Italy, rose up in rebellion. They were crushed with terrifying efficiency. The Roman response wasn't just to defeat them, it was to utterly erase their will to fight. Their leaders were executed, their lands were confiscated, and their city was dismantled. The message to every other Italian ally was unmistakable: Rome's friendship was mandatory, and its anger was absolute. But while Rome was bullying its neighbors, the real storm was brewing in Africa. Hamilcar Barca had finally cornered the last of the rebel army. They had retreated to a narrow pass called the Saw, and they thought they were safe. Hamilcar had other plans. He didn't attack the front of the pass, he sent troops to scale the cliffs and attack from behind. The rebels were caught in a trap, surrounded on all sides. For days, they held out, but hunger and despair did what Roman steel couldn't. The rebel leaders, Matho and Spendius, were captured. Hamilcar's revenge was terrifyingly public. He paraded them through the streets of Carthage, and then, in front of a massive, screaming crowd, he crucified them. It was a brutal spectacle designed to send a message to anyone who dared defy Carthage. But for Hamilcar, this victory tasted like ash. He knew the real enemy wasn't these ragged rebels. It was Rome. And he had just spent 3 years of his life and the best of his army crushing a rebellion that Rome had secretly funded. The hatred inside him was no longer a flame. It was a forge. The mercenary war was over, but its scars ran deep. Carthage was bankrupt, her population decimated, her trade routes shattered. Yet, she still had Hamilcar Barca. And Hamilcar had a plan. He knew Carthage could never defeat Rome on the sea. So he looked to the west, to the vast, silver-rich lands of Spain. He proposed a new campaign, to conquer a new empire for Carthage, to build a new army, and to create a new base from which to strike at Rome. The Carthaginian Senate, tired of his ambition but with no better option, reluctantly agreed. They gave him a small army and sent him on his way. Before he left, he took his 9-year-old son to the altar of the god Baal. He made the boy swear an oath of undying hatred against Rome. The boy, wide-eyed and solemn, placed his hand on the sacred offering and swore. His name was Hannibal. As Hamilcar watched his son make that vow, he must have felt a grim satisfaction. He had lost the war, but he had created a weapon. A weapon that would one day be unleashed upon the Republic. A weapon that would bring Rome to the brink of annihilation. Rome watched Hamilcar's departure with a mix of relief and unease. The immediate threat was gone, but the memory of his brilliance lingered. For nearly a decade, he campaigned in Spain, conquering tribes and forging a new army from the fierce Iberian warriors. He was building something, and Rome knew it. But they were distracted. The Republic was enjoying a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. They had new provinces, a dominant navy, and a treasury full of Carthaginian silver. The old virtues of austerity and duty were slowly being replaced by a taste for Greek luxury and the thrill of political games. They didn't see the storm gathering in the west. They didn't see a father forging a weapon of revenge, or a son growing up in the blood-soaked camps of a new war. The peace was an illusion. The war they had won had only bought them time. And as Hamilcar's shadow grew longer, a new generation of Roman leaders was growing complacent, blind to the fact that their greatest test wasn't behind them. It was still to come. And the boy who swore that oath was now a man, ready to make good on his promise. But that's a story for another time. For now, the Republic rests, blissfully unaware that the calm before the storm is about to break. The question is, will they be ready for Hannibal? For 9 years, Hamilcar Barca was a ghost haunting the edges of the Roman world. While Rome feasted on its victories and grew fat on Carthaginian silver, he was in Spain, carving out a new empire. He wasn't just conquering tribes, he was melting them down and reforging them into a single, deadly weapon. Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, he welded them all into an army that owed its loyalty not to Carthage, but to him. And with him, every step of the way, was his eldest son, a boy barely in his teens. Hannibal. He was learning the art of war not from a textbook, but from the blood-soaked earth of 100 battlefields. He learned how to read a landscape, how to inspire men, and how to hate Rome with a cold, burning fire that his father had ignited in his soul. Rome saw the conquests. They saw the new province growing in Spain. But they saw it as a distant problem, a Carthaginian problem. They never saw the forge, and they never saw the weapon being shaped inside it. The Republic was too busy enjoying its own reflection to notice the storm building on the horizon. The peace in Rome was an illusion, a gilded cage built on the spoils of war. The Senate still debated the finer points of law, but the real currency was now gold, not virtue. Greek statues filled the atriums of the patricians. Greek tutors taught their children. Greek cooks prepared their feasts. The man who had once been a farmer soldier was now a politician, more concerned with his next triumph than his duty to the state. They looked down at the new provinces as sources of income, not as responsibilities. And in this haze of self-satisfaction, they made a fatal error. They saw Hamilcar Barca's victories in Spain as a welcome development. It kept Carthage busy, they reasoned. It drained their treasury. They even signed a treaty with his successor, Hasdrubal, agreeing that the Carthaginians would not cross the Ebro River. It was a line in the sand, a boundary they thought would contain the problem. But they forgot one thing. The weapon being forged wasn't in Carthage. It was in Spain. And the hand that would wield it had never forgotten the oath it swore to a god of fire and blood. Then, in 221 BC, the hammer struck. Hamilcar was dead, killed in battle, or perhaps by an assassin's spear, the accounts differ. And his son, now barely in his 20s, stood before the army. Hannibal. He was not just his father's son, he was his father's masterpiece. He had his father's strategic genius, but he possessed a charisma that was all his own. He could speak to the Iberian warriors in their own language, share their rations, and sleep on the hard ground with them. He was a man who led from the front, and his men would have followed him into the mouth of hell itself. And that is precisely where he intended to lead them. Rome watched this changing of the guard with a flicker of unease. This boy was young, unpredictable. But their attention was still fixed inward, on the petty squabbles of the Forum. They underestimated him. They saw a barbarian warlord, not the most brilliant military mind of the age. They didn't see the student who had studied every campaign of Pyrrhus, every maneuver of his father. They only saw the enemy they wanted to see, not the one that was about to burn their world to the ground. Hannibal's first act as commander was not to attack. It was to test. He spent a year consolidating his power, completing the conquest of the tribes south of the Ebro. He knew that the treaty his brother-in-law had signed was a leash. And he had no intention of wearing it. But he didn't break the treaty. He found a loophole. The city of Saguntum, a Greek colony, was south of the Ebro. It was also a Roman ally. By attacking Saguntum, Hannibal knew he would not be crossing the river. He would be provoking the Romans, daring them to respond. It was a chess move, a brilliant, deadly provocation. Rome sent envoys, demanding he stand down. Hannibal received them with icy courtesy, telling them that the city's quarrel was with Carthage, not Rome. He then accused Rome of meddling in Carthaginian affairs. The envoys returned to Rome with their tails between their legs, and the Senate erupted in fury. They wanted war. But war with a foreign power meant sending legions to Spain, a long, expensive campaign. They hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, Hannibal saw his opening. He didn't want a war in Spain. He wanted a war in Italy. He wanted to take the fight to the gates of Rome itself. And he had a plan so audacious, so insane, that no one in Rome would believe it until it was too late. The siege of Saguntum was a brutal, 8-month affair. The city was well fortified and full of Roman allies who fought with a desperation born of knowing that no help was coming. Rome, still paralyzed by indecision, sent another embassy, but this time to Carthage, demanding that Hannibal be handed over for trial. The Carthaginian Senate, caught between their fear of Rome and their fear of the Barca family, gave a non-answer. The Roman envoy, a man named Quintus Fabius, was a master of blunt language. He gathered his toga into a fold and said, "In this fold, I carry peace and war. Choose which one you want." The Carthaginian Senate told him to choose for himself. And Fabius, dropping the fold of his toga, declared, "Then I give you war." The Senate of Carthage, in a moment of terror and pride, accepted the challenge. The formal declaration of war was made. It was a moment of grim satisfaction for Hannibal. He had his war. His army was ready, his plans were made. Now, he had to do the impossible. He had to march an army, including war elephants, from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps, into the heart of Italy. Every step of the way was an unknown. Every nation he crossed was a potential enemy. And waiting for him at the end was the greatest military machine the world had ever seen. The die was cast. The storm had broken. The declaration of war was a thunderclap in the Forum. But it was a distant thunderclap, one that spoke of a campaign in a faraway land. The Senate began to debate where to send the legions. To Spain, to crush Hannibal's base. Or to Africa, to strike at Carthage itself. They were so focused on the map, they forgot the man. While they were arguing, Hannibal was moving. He had already slipped out of his winter quarters in New Carthage with an army of over 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. He crossed the Ebro, and then, astonishingly, he turned north. He wasn't going to wait for the Romans to come to him. He was coming to them. The Romans, when they heard the news, were stunned. Marching an army through the hostile tribes of Gaul was a madman's gamble. But Hannibal was not just a madman, he was a genius. He bribed some tribes, crushed others, and moved with a speed that defied belief. He reached the Rhone River before the Roman legions, who had been sent to intercept him in Spain, even knew he was gone. The question that hung in the air, the question that would decide the fate of the Republic, was a simple one: what would he do next? Would he turn west to face the Roman army in Spain? Or would he dare the impossible, and cross the Alps into Italy? The Republic held its breath, waiting for the answer. It wouldn't have to wait long. The greatest gamble in military history was about to begin. And the man leading it was the son of the man who had sworn to destroy them. The ghosts of the past, it seemed, were not content to rest. They were marching to the very gates of Rome. The Senate in Rome could not agree. Was Hannibal mad? Marching an army through the Alps in early autumn? Impossible. They were convinced he'd turn back, or be destroyed by the mountains themselves. They were so sure, they sent only 2 legions north to Gaul, under the command of a cautious general named Publius Cornelius Scipio. But Hannibal wasn't mad. He was a force of nature. He crossed the Pyrenees, losing thousands to desertion and hostile tribes. He reached the Rhone, and when Scipio tried to intercept him, Hannibal simply slipped away, moving upstream into the mountains. The Alps rose before him like a wall of white stone. His army, now down to around 40,000 men and 37 elephants, faced a choice: turn back, or face the impossible. Hannibal gave the order to advance. The climb took weeks. Ice, snow, and howling winds. Men and beasts slipped off narrow paths into the abyss. The mountaineers attacked from above, rolling boulders down on them. Yet, they pushed on. When they finally reached the summit, Hannibal gathered his exhausted men. He pointed down into the green plains of Italy below them. There, he shouted, there is Rome. There is our goal. We conquer, or we die. And they descended. After 15 days of unimaginable hardship, Hannibal's army stumbled into the Po Valley. They were a shadow of their former selves. Barely 26,000 men survived, and most of the elephants had died. But they were in Italy. The Roman Republic had been caught completely off guard. The legions under Scipio, who had raced back from Gaul, were exhausted and outnumbered. Hannibal, with his cavalry, rode circles around them. At the river Ticinus, he attacked first. The Roman cavalry was routed, and Scipio was wounded, saved only by his teenage son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who charged into the melee to pull his father from the enemy. The Romans retreated to the town of Placentia, but Hannibal was relentless. He caught them again at the Tribune River. He knew a secret: the river was cold, and the Roman soldiers would be freezing and hungry. He sent his brother Mago with a hidden force of cavalry to wait in ambush. Then, he sent his Numidian cavalry to taunt the Romans into crossing the icy water. The Romans, always proud, took the bait. They crossed the Trebia, soaked and shivering, and were met by Hannibal's fresh, well-fed troops. The battle was a massacre. The Romans were surrounded, and only the stubbornness of their center, the infantry, allowed a few thousand to cut their way out. The rest were slaughtered or drowned in the river. The Republic had lost its first great battle of the war. And Hannibal was just getting started. The winter of 218 BC was a bitter one for Rome. The news of Trebia spread like wildfire. Panic began to grip the city. The Senate, desperate, raised new legions, but they knew they were facing a general unlike any they had ever seen. Hannibal, meanwhile, was not resting. He moved his army south, into Etruria, the heartland of Italy. He knew that the new Roman consul, Gaius Flaminius, was a hot-headed populist, eager for glory. Hannibal used this against him. He marched past the Roman army, burning farms and villages, provoking Flaminius to follow him. Flaminius, furious, abandoned his defensive position and chased Hannibal into a narrow valley between Lake Trasimene and the hills. The lake was on one side, the mountains on the other, and a thick morning fog rolled in, hiding everything. Hannibal placed his troops on the hills above, waiting. When the Roman column was stretched out along the shore, he struck. The fog was so thick, the Romans couldn't see the enemy until they were on top of them. The battle was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Romans were cut down in the water, on the road, everywhere. Flaminius himself was killed, and his body was never found. Over 15,000 Romans died that day. Hannibal's men hunted down the survivors, many of whom drowned trying to escape into the lake. The Republic had lost its second great battle in a matter of months. And the road to Rome was now wide open. The disaster at Trasimene was a knockout blow. The Roman army in Etruria had been annihilated. The Senate, in a state of near panic, did something they had only done in the most extreme emergencies: they appointed a dictator. Their choice was a seasoned patrician, a man of immense authority and unshakable resolve, Quintus Fabius Maximus. But Fabius was not a man of bold, dramatic strokes. He was a fox, not a lion. He understood that Hannibal was far from home, with no supply lines, no reinforcements. He could only win if the Romans were foolish enough to fight him. Fabius had no intention of doing that. He followed Hannibal with his army, but he kept to the high ground, always out of reach. He harassed the Carthaginian foraging parties, cut off their supplies, and refused every offer of a pitched battle. The Romans, who were used to charging into battle with glory in their hearts, were frustrated. They called Fabius cunctator, the delayer, and not as a compliment. They mocked him as a coward. Hannibal, meanwhile, was desperate. He marched his army through the richest farmland in Italy, devastating it, hoping to force the dictator to fight. But Fabius held his nerve. He watched as Hannibal's army marched past his, heading south, towards the very heart of the Republic. And he waited. Fabius's strategy, while brilliant, was tearing Rome apart. The soldiers under his command were restless, and his second-in-command, Marcus Minucius Rufus, was a hothead who openly mocked the dictator's caution. The political pressure in Rome was immense. The people demanded action. They wanted revenge, not a waiting game. Hannibal, sensing the discontent, decided to pour fuel on the fire. He marched his army to the town of Geronium, within sight of the Roman camp. Then, he did something that seemed like a blunder: he sent away a large portion of his foragers, leaving his camp seemingly vulnerable. Minucius, seeing his chance, begged Fabius for permission to attack. Fabius refused. So Minucius, in a fit of insubordination, attacked on his own. He was immediately caught in a trap. Hannibal had set it perfectly. The Roman troops were surrounded and were being slaughtered. Only the last-minute arrival of Fabius, with his main force, saved them from complete annihilation. The Senate, instead of punishing Minucius, rewarded him with equal command to Fabius, splitting the army in two. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But Fabius, ever the politician, said nothing. He just waited. And he knew that Hannibal, with his army growing fat on Italian plunder, was making a terrible mistake. He was underestimating the resilience of the Republic. The year 216 BC dawned with Rome still bleeding. The people had had enough of Fabius's cautious strategy. They wanted a decisive victory. They elected two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro, a populist demagogue, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a seasoned general who had learned to respect Hannibal. They raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Over 80,000 men, a vast force of citizens and allies. The plan was simple: march south, find Hannibal, and crush him with sheer numbers. Hannibal was waiting for them. He had chosen his ground near the town of Cannae, where the Aufidus River provided a flat plain that was perfect for his cavalry. When the armies met, the Roman legions formed a massive, deep formation, designed to smash through the Carthaginian center like a battering ram. But Hannibal had anticipated this. He formed his own line in a crescent, with his weakest troops in the middle, and his best infantry and cavalry on the wings. As the Romans charged, the Carthaginian center gave way, but it didn't break. It bent backwards, drawing the Romans deeper into a trap. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry swept around and attacked the Roman rear. The Roman formation, now surrounded on all sides, was compressed into a killing zone. The battle became a slaughter. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the field. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history. And the Republic, now utterly defeated, had only one question left: what would Hannibal do next? Would he march on the gates of Rome itself? The answer, when it came, was a surprise that would test the very soul of the Republic. But that is a story for another day. If you want to see how Rome survived the greatest crisis in its history, subscribe and hit that bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The dust hadn't even settled on the field of Cannae when the first rider reached the gates of Rome, his horse lathered in foam, his voice a ragged scream of despair. He didn't need to say the words, the horror was written on his face. 50,000 Romans, dead in a single afternoon. The city didn't erupt in panic. It went silent. A silence more terrifying than any battle cry. Then came the wailing of women, the frantic running of messengers, the slamming of gates. The Senate convened in the dead of night, torches casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Some spoke of surrender, of negotiating with Hannibal. But then a senator, his toga torn, stood up. He spoke not of defeat, but of one man. A consul, a commander who had fallen in the fight. He wasn't a great general. He wasn't a brilliant tactician. But he was a Roman. And he had died fighting. The Senate, in a move that shocked even their enemies, voted to honor this man's sacrifice with a public funeral and a day of national mourning. They were turning a catastrophe into a story of martyrdom. They were telling the people of Rome, and the world, that they would rather die to the last man than bend their knee to Carthage. Hannibal, expecting envoys with olive branches, got something else entirely. He had captured thousands of Roman prisoners after Cannae. He sent a delegation to Rome, offering to sell them back at a reasonable price, a gesture of goodwill, a first step toward peace. The Roman Senate didn't even debate it. They refused. They declared that they would not ransom prisoners, and they forbade any family from paying for their loved one's freedom. It was a brutal, heartless decision. But it was a brilliant one. It sent a message to every Roman soldier: there is no safety net. There is no surrender. You will either win or you will die. The families of the prisoners were devastated, but they were also hardened. They had been given a terrible choice, and they had chosen the Republic over their own blood. Meanwhile, the city itself was being turned into a fortress. Every man capable of bearing arms, from the oldest senator to the youngest slave, was enlisted. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: old spears, rusty swords, even tools from the fields. The very idea of Rome, once a place of laws and civic life, was being reforged into a military camp. The war wasn't just a conflict between armies anymore. It had become a war for survival, and every citizen was now a soldier. But even as Rome armed itself, a new kind of leader was emerging, a man who understood that Hannibal wasn't just a general to be beaten in a single battle, but a problem to be managed. His name was Marcus Claudius Marcellus. He was a veteran of the wars in Sicily, a man of immense physical courage and tactical flexibility. Unlike the doomed consuls at Cannae, Marcellus didn't see Hannibal as an invincible monster. He saw him as a brilliant, but tired, enemy. He gathered the remnants of the army that had survived Cannae, along with new recruits, and marched south to face Hannibal again. He didn't seek a grand, decisive battle. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal's army, skirmishing with his outposts, harassing his foragers, and refusing to be drawn into a trap. And then, near the small town of Nola, he saw his opportunity. Hannibal, frustrated by Marcellus's tactics, moved his army to attack the town, expecting the Romans to either flee or attack his main force head-on. But Marcellus did something different. He left a small force in his camp to keep the fires burning, and under the cover of night, he moved his main army out of the camp and positioned it for a surprise attack. When Hannibal's forces approached the town, they were hit from the side by the Romans, a sudden, violent assault that broke their formation. For the first time since Trebia, since Trasimene, since Cannae, Hannibal had been forced to retreat from a Roman army. It wasn't a decisive victory. It was a pinprick. But for Rome, it was a ray of hope in an ocean of despair. The victory at Nola was a spark, but the fire of war still raged across Italy. Hannibal, enraged by his first real setback, turned his fury on the countryside. He marched his army through Campania, one of the wealthiest and most fertile regions of Italy, systematically destroying everything in his path. He burned farms, slaughtered livestock, and butchered the inhabitants, men, women, and children. His goal was simple: to break the will of the Roman people by showing them that their allies were helpless, that their lands were not safe, and that the Republic could not protect them. It was a brutal, cynical strategy. And it worked. Several of Rome's oldest allies, cities that had been loyal for centuries, began to waver. The city of Capua, the second largest city in Italy, decided to defect to Hannibal. It was a devastating blow. Capua was not just a city, it was a symbol. If she could betray Rome, who couldn't? The Senate, reeling from this betrayal, looked for a new target for their rage and their need for a victory. They found it in Sicily. The city of Syracuse, once a staunch ally, had fallen under the influence of pro-Carthaginian factions after the death of its king, Hiero, a loyal friend of Rome. Now, with Hannibal rampaging in Italy, the new leaders of Syracuse saw their chance to break free. They declared war on Rome, and an army was sent to bring them back into the fold. The command of this crucial expedition was given to the hero of Nola, Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Marcellus arrived at Syracuse with a fleet and a veteran army, expecting a quick siege. The city was a jewel, a bastion of Greek culture and wealth. But its true treasures were not in its temples or its treasuries. They were in the mind of one man, Archimedes. Archimedes was an old man, a mathematician, an astronomer, a philosopher. He was the closest thing the ancient world had to a mad scientist. When the Roman fleet sailed into the harbor, they saw the city walls bristling with strange, unknown machines. They didn't understand what they were facing. Huge cranes, hidden inside the walls, swung out over the water. They dropped massive boulders onto the Roman ships, crushing them like toys. Other machines, like giant crossbows, fired bolts the size of spear shafts, punching through the hulls of the warships. The Roman soldiers on the siege towers were met with a hail of stones and burning pitch. But the most terrifying weapon was the claw of Archimedes. A massive iron hook, suspended from a crane, would be dropped onto a Roman ship. The hook would then be winched up, lifting the ship out of the water and shaking it violently until the crew was thrown into the sea, before letting it crash back down into the harbor. It was a scene of total chaos and destruction. The invincible Roman legions, the conquerors of Gauls and Carthaginians, were being defeated by an old man's toys. Marcellus, watching from his flagship, was forced to call off the assault. He had met an enemy he could not defeat with swords and courage alone. For months, Marcellus besieged Syracuse, but Archimedes' inventions repelled every attack. The siege became a war of wits, a clash between Roman determination and Greek genius. But the Republic was running out of patience. Every day spent at Syracuse was a day Hannibal could ravage Italy. The Senate sent word to Marcellus, "Take the city, by any means necessary." And Marcellus, the soldier, began to think like a thief. He learned that the Syracusans were celebrating a religious festival, a night of feasting and drinking. He knew that their guard would be down. So, he launched a night assault, not on the sea walls, but on a less defended land gate, with a small force of elite soldiers. They scaled the walls silently and opened the gates from within. The city fell without a fight. Marcellus, from his command post, looked down at the city he had struggled so long to conquer. He had promised his soldiers the city's plunder. But as he looked at the home of Archimedes, a thought crossed his mind. This was not just a city. It was a library of knowledge, a museum of art, a treasure of the mind. He ordered his men to find the old man and bring him to him unharmed. He wanted to meet the genius who had defied him. But it was too late. In the chaos of the sack, a Roman soldier broke into Archimedes' home. The old man, hunched over a diagram in the sand, was lost in thought. "Don't disturb my circles," he reportedly said to the soldier. The soldier, not understanding, ran him through with his sword. The greatest mind of the age was dead. And Rome had gained a city, but lost something far more precious. The Republic had won a victory, but it was a victory that tasted like ashes. The gates of Rome were not the only ones stained with Carthaginian blood. While Hannibal bled Italy dry, another war raged in the shadows, far from the Senate's desperate gaze. In the forests and mountains of Spain, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio was carving a legend of his own. But his enemies were not just the armies of Carthage. They were the ghosts of his own family, a father and an uncle, both slain in this very land. Scipio was barely 25, an age when most Romans were still learning to wield a sword. Yet he carried the weight of a dynasty on his shoulders. He looked at the map of the war, at the long, bloody stalemate in Italy, and he saw a path to victory no one else dared to imagine. A direct strike, not at Hannibal, but at the source of his power. He was about to gamble everything on a single, audacious move that would either save the Republic or doom it forever. To understand Scipio's madness, you have to understand his grief. His father and uncle had been masters of Spain, fighting a brutal, thankless war for years. They had won battles, forged alliances, and pushed the Carthaginians back. Then, in a moment of overconfidence, they were caught in a trap. The armies were split, the camps were overrun, and both Scipios were killed in the chaos. Rome didn't just lose 2 generals, it lost an entire strategy. The Senate, terrified of sending another army to be butchered, had written Spain off. They decided to simply hold the line in Italy and pray for a miracle. But a young man, barely old enough to shave, stood before them and demanded the command. He didn't ask for a huge army. He asked for volunteers, for the survivors of the old campaign, for men who knew the land and burned for revenge. He was given a title, proconsul. But what he truly received was a mandate to do the impossible. And he knew, from the very first day, that conventional tactics would get him killed just like his father. The Carthaginian forces in Spain were not a single army. They were 3 separate commands, led by 3 brothers, Hasdrubal Barca, Hasdrubal Gisco, and Mago. They were scattered across the peninsula, each guarding their own territory, each jealous of the other's power. They were also watching Rome's new general, this boy Scipio. They assumed he would be cautious, that he would waste years trying to rebuild his father's alliances. They assumed wrong. Scipio had a plan so bold it would make a gambler blush. He wasn't going to fight the Carthaginians in the field. He was going to cut off their head. His target was Carthago Nova, the jewel of Carthaginian Spain. It was their treasury, their arsenal, their shipyard, and their hostage pool. It was also considered impregnable, protected by a lagoon on one side and the sea on the other. A direct assault was madness. So, Scipio decided to do the one thing no one expected. He marched his entire army, with lightning speed, straight for the city, before the three Carthaginian armies could unite to stop him. When the Romans arrived at Carthago Nova, the defenders were confident. They had a garrison, they had walls, and they had the lagoon. They thought the Romans would have to build a siege ramp, which would take weeks, giving the Carthaginian relief armies time to arrive. But Scipio had a secret. He had learned from local fishermen that the lagoon was shallow, and at low tide, it was fordable. The city's defenses were weakest on the lagoon side, as it was considered impassable. Scipio launched a full-scale assault on the main walls to draw the defenders' attention. The noise, the arrows, the ladders, it was all a distraction. Then, when the tide went out, he sent a picked force of soldiers wading across the lagoon. They reached the city wall, which was low and poorly defended on that side, and scaled it almost unopposed. The city fell in a single day. It was a flawless victory. Scipio had captured the enemy's main base, a fortune in silver, and, most importantly, hostages who would become key bargaining chips. He had also sent a message to Carthage. Rome had a new kind of general, one who didn't fight by the old rules. The fall of Carthago Nova was a masterstroke, but it didn't win the war. The three Carthaginian armies were still in the field, and they were still dangerous. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, was the most immediate threat. He was planning to march to Italy to reinforce Hannibal. If he succeeded, Rome would be crushed between two Carthaginian armies. Scipio knew he had to stop him, but he was outnumbered. So, he used his greatest weapon, psychology. He released the Iberian hostages he had captured at Carthago Nova, sending them home with gifts and promises of friendship. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He was turning the tribes of Spain against Carthage. Then, he marched his army to face Hasdrubal at the Battle of Becula. It was a brutal fight, but Scipio's tactics were superior. He used his infantry in a double envelopment, crushing the Carthaginian flanks. Hasdrubal was forced to flee, but he escaped with a significant portion of his army, including his elephants. Scipio had won a great victory, but he knew the war was not over. He had merely delayed the inevitable. Scipio had won the battle, but Hasdrubal Barca had escaped. He was now marching north, towards the Alps, determined to join his brother. Scipio couldn't follow him, he had too many other problems in Spain. He had to trust that Rome could handle the threat. But Hasdrubal's escape was a bitter pill. It meant that the war was about to enter a new, even more terrifying phase. The Republic had survived Hannibal for years, but could it survive two Hannibals? Scipio stayed behind, not to celebrate, but to finish the job. He had to dismantle the remaining Carthaginian power in Spain. He had to erase the Barca name from the map. The war in Spain was not just a sideshow anymore. It was the key to everything. If he failed, Rome would be lost. If he succeeded, he would be the man who cut the heart out of the Carthaginian Empire. But for now, all he could do was watch Hasdrubal's dust cloud disappear over the horizon and wonder if he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. He was gone. Hasdrubal Barca, with his veterans and his war elephants, had slipped through Scipio's fingers and was now marching toward the Alps. Scipio stood on the battlefield at Becula, the dust of the retreating enemy still hanging in the air, and he felt a cold dread. He had won a victory, but he had failed in his primary objective. He had let the monster escape. The fate of Italy, the fate of Rome itself, now hung on a race he could not run. He was stuck in Spain, with a war to finish, while his worst nightmare marched closer to his homeland. Every day, he imagined Hannibal's face lighting up with hope when he heard his brother was coming. Every night, he saw the two Carthaginian armies merging into an unstoppable force. He had to trust that the men he left behind, the grim-faced senators, the hardened legions, could handle what was coming. But deep down, a voice whispered, could they? Could anyone? Back in his new headquarters at Carthago Nova, Scipio didn't have time to brood. The war in Spain was far from over. The remaining Carthaginian commanders were still a threat, but a more insidious enemy was growing within his own ranks. A group of his soldiers, angry about unpaid back pay and rumors of a long, thankless campaign, mutinied. They seized a nearby town and threatened to join the Carthaginians. It was a test of his authority, a direct challenge to his leadership. Scipio didn't respond with a massacre. He responded with a masterclass in psychological warfare. He sent envoys to the mutineers, not with threats, but with promises of payment and forgiveness. He offered them a way back into the fold. Then, on the day they were to surrender, he surrounded their camp with his loyal legions. He gave a speech about loyalty, about the sacred bond between a general and his men, and then, with a heavy heart, he ordered his soldiers to seize the ringleaders and execute them on the spot. He had shown mercy, but he had also shown steel. He had to be both father and executioner to his own army. The mutiny was crushed, and the lesson was learned. Scipio was no lenient master, but he was a just one. With his army's loyalty restored, Scipio turned his attention back to the political game. He knew that the key to lasting victory in Spain was not just military might, but alliances. The Iberian tribes were tired of being pawns in a foreign war. So, he sought out the most powerful of them all, Syphax, a Numidian king who was courted by both Rome and Carthage. It was a dangerous move. Syphax was a wild card, a ruler who played both sides for his own advantage. Scipio, however, was a master of charm. He crossed to North Africa with only a few ships, walking into the king's palace as a guest, not a conqueror. He brought no army, only his presence, his intelligence, and his vision. He spoke of a world where Rome and Numidia could be friends, and where Carthage's greed would be contained. The meeting was a stunning success. Syphax, impressed by the young Roman's boldness and sincerity, agreed to ally with Rome. It was a diplomatic victory that could shift the entire balance of the war. But back in Rome, this daring trip was seen as reckless, even dangerous. His enemies in the Senate, led by the old and cautious Fabius Maximus, began to whisper, what was this young man up to? He was acting like a king, not a servant of the Republic. While Scipio was weaving his web of alliances, a storm was brewing back in Rome. The Senate, a body of old men who saw danger in every shadow, had grown deeply suspicious of their young proconsul. Here was a man who had been given an army and a mission, and instead of simply fighting, he was making grand political overtures, crossing into Africa without permission, and acting with an independence that bordered on insubordination. They recalled him. They ordered him to return to Rome to explain his actions. It was a direct challenge to his authority. Scipio could have obeyed. He could have gone back and groveled, hoping to appease the old guard. But he didn't. He had the momentum, and he knew that to stop now would be to lose everything. In a move that was both brilliant and terrifying, he ignored the Senate summons. He sent back a message, saying that he was too busy finishing the war to play their political games. He then marched his army south, not to the Senate, but to the one city that still symbolized Carthaginian power in Spain, Gades. It was a shocking act of defiance. He was betting that a stunning victory would be his best defense. He was putting his own judgment above the will of the Senate, setting a precedent that would echo through the centuries. He was becoming more than just a general, he was becoming a force unto himself. Gades fell without a fight. The city, the last great bastion of the Barca family in Spain, opened its gates to Scipio. The Carthaginian commanders, demoralized and outmaneuvered, fled. The war in Spain was over. Scipio had not only conquered a land, he had annihilated an empire. He had erased the Barca name from the map. He had cut the heart out of the Carthaginian war effort. But when he finally returned to Rome, a triumphant hero, he was met not with a hero's welcome, but with cold suspicion. The Senate, frightened by his power and his popularity, refused to grant him the triumph he had earned. They were afraid. They had seen generals like him before. They had seen the Scipios, the Marcelluses, the men who thought they were above the law. They saw in him not a savior, but a potential tyrant. Scipio was furious, but he was also a politician. He knew he had to play their game, for now. He accepted the insult, biding his time, waiting for the moment when he would have the power to force his will upon them. He knew that the true test was yet to come. The war was still raging in Italy, and he had a score to settle with Hannibal himself. But he also knew that to defeat Hannibal, he would need to go beyond the Senate's control. He would need to become something they feared even more. And what of the monster who had slipped away? Hasdrubal Barca, after a brutal winter crossing of the Alps, had finally arrived in Italy. He had lost many men, but he had brought a hardened, battle-tested corps. He was now marching south, desperately trying to link up with his brother, Hannibal. He desperately needed to find him before the Roman armies could close in. The two brothers were in different corners of the country, each hunted, each searching for a bond that would change the world. The Roman Senate knew this. They knew that if the two Carthaginian forces ever joined, the Republic would be crushed. They had to stop Hasdrubal at all costs. They had to gamble everything on one final, desperate battle. But they had a secret weapon, a plan, a desperate plan born in the war rooms of Rome. They would send an army north to trap Hasdrubal, and they would need to be led by a man as cunning as the enemy himself. The man they chose was a consul, a veteran of many wars, and a master of deception. His name was Nero. And he was about to do something so audacious, so utterly insane, that it would forever change the course of the war. But that, my friends, is the story for another time. The stage is set. The armies are marching. The fate of the Republic hangs on a knife's edge. Hasdrubal is coming, and Rome is running out of time. Will the two brothers finally meet? Or will the Republic find a way to tear them apart? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter is the one that will decide everything. Hasdrubal Barca was coming. He had slipped through Scipio's fingers in Spain, crossed the Alps with a battle-hardened army, and was now marching south through Italy, desperate to join his brother Hannibal. Rome knew the stakes: if the two Carthaginian armies united, the Republic would be crushed. The Senate needed a plan, and they needed a man cunning enough to pull it off. They found him in a consul named Gaius Claudius Nero, a man whose name would become synonymous with audacity. Nero and his colleague, Marcus Livius Salinator, devised a scheme so insane it bordered on suicide. Nero would take a massive chunk of his army and march north in secret, leaving his camp with just enough men to fool Hannibal into thinking the entire force was still there. He would join Livius and together they would smash Hasdrubal before he ever reached his brother. The risk was astronomical. If Hannibal discovered the trick, he could march on a nearly defenseless Rome. But they had no choice. The fate of the Republic hung on this one desperate gamble. The two Roman armies met in the darkness of northern Italy. Nero's forced march had been brutal, but it had worked. He and Livius now faced Hasdrubal's forces across the Metaurus River. Hasdrubal, a cautious and intelligent general, was wary. The Roman camp looked too large, too strong. He suspected that both consuls were present, and he feared a trap. But he was also running out of time and supplies. He had to break through. On the night before the battle, he tried to slip away, moving his army along the river to find a better crossing. The Romans, alert and aggressive, followed him. The next morning, the two armies finally clashed. Hasdrubal placed his veteran Spanish and Gallic infantry on his right, his weakest troops on the left. The Roman attack was fierce, but the Carthaginian line held. Then Nero, seeing that the fighting on the right was at a stalemate, made a decision that would seal Hasdrubal's fate. He pulled his elite troops from the right wing of the Roman line, marched them behind the entire army, and launched a devastating attack on the Carthaginian left flank. The move was sudden, brutal, and completely unexpected. The Carthaginian left flank collapsed under Nero's surprise attack. The Spanish and Gallic veterans on the right fought on with desperate courage, but they were now surrounded on three sides. Hasdrubal, seeing that all was lost, did not try to flee. He rode into the thick of the fighting, seeking an honorable death. He was killed, his body lost among the thousands of fallen. The battle was over. The threat of a Carthaginian union was gone forever. Nero, ever the pragmatist, then did something that was both a brutal act of psychological warfare and a display of Roman ruthlessness. He took the severed head of Hasdrubal and had it carried south, straight to Hannibal's camp. He had it thrown into the Carthaginian lines as a message. When Hannibal saw his brother's head, he reportedly said, "I recognize the fortune of Carthage." The bond that could have saved the Carthaginian cause in Italy was broken. Hannibal was now isolated, trapped in a foreign land with no hope of reinforcement. The tide of the war had turned irrevocably in Rome's favor. With Hasdrubal dead, Hannibal was cornered in Italy. He fought on for a few more years, but he was a general without an army, a predator without teeth. Rome, sensing victory, turned its attention to the final act, the invasion of Africa. The man to lead this invasion was, of course, Scipio Africanus. He had returned from Spain a hero, but also a man with enemies. The old guard, led by Fabius Maximus, argued against the invasion, claiming it was too risky, that Rome was exhausted. But Scipio was relentless. He convinced the Senate to give him the command, but they denied him the right to levy new troops. He was forced to rely on volunteers and veterans who flocked to his banner, eager for glory and revenge. He landed in Africa in 204 BC and immediately began to wreak havoc, defeating Carthaginian forces and forging alliances with the Numidian king Massinissa. The Carthaginians, desperate, were forced to do the unthinkable. They recalled Hannibal from Italy. The greatest general of the age was coming home to defend his city. The stage was set for a final, epic confrontation between the two titans of the age. Hannibal returned to Carthage and immediately took command of the city's defenses. He knew that a pitched battle against the young and aggressive Scipio was a gamble, but he also knew that a long war of attrition was a luxury he no longer had. The two armies finally met at Zama in 202 BC. It was a battle of titans. Hannibal had 80 war elephants, which he launched in a desperate charge to break the Roman lines. But Scipio was prepared. He had arranged his legions in maniples with gaps, and his velites, the skirmishers, were equipped with javelins and horns to spook the beasts. The elephants, confused and panicked, were either driven back into the Carthaginian lines or channeled harmlessly through the gaps. The two infantries then clashed in a brutal, grinding fight. The Roman legions, hardened by years of war, held firm. On the flank, Scipio's Numidian cavalry, under Massinissa, returned from chasing the Carthaginian cavalry and crashed into the rear of Hannibal's line. The Carthaginian army, caught between the Roman infantry and the returning cavalry, was annihilated. Hannibal, seeing the destruction of his last army, fled the field. He had been defeated for the first and only time in his life. Zama was the end. Carthage sued for peace, surrendering its navy, its war elephants, and its empire. Hannibal fled into exile, a broken but unrepentant enemy of Rome. Scipio returned to Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a threat. He was granted the title Africanus, but the triumph he was given was a quiet one. The Senate, still fearful of his power, watched his every move. He was a man who had saved the Republic, but he had also shown it how fragile its institutions were. The Republic had survived its greatest external threat, but the seeds of its own destruction had been sown. The old values of the Republic, the fear of a king, the power of the Senate, were all eroding. Scipio would spend his final years defending himself against political attacks, his family name tarnished by rivals like Cato the Elder. He would die in self-imposed exile, a bitter and disillusioned man. The Republic had defeated Carthage, but it had created a new kind of Roman, one who was more loyal to his own glory than to the state. The Republic had won the war, but the peace would be its undoing. The stage is now set for the next chapter, a chapter not of foreign wars, but of civil war. A chapter where the greatest enemy of Rome would be Rome itself. What happens when the men who saved the Republic turn their swords on each other? What happens when the Roman Republic starts to tear itself apart? Subscribe and hit the bell, because the next part of this story, the story of the Gracchi brothers and the beginning of the Roman Revolution, is one you will not want to miss.